I'm here with Brian Hudson, who's done an extensive report into the connection between the child maintenance service and suicide. Brian, why?
Well, I came into contact with the child maintenance service late in 2019 at the tail end of a very sinister experience in family court after separating from my son's mother. And a fraudulent claim was made against me into the child maintenance service. So at that point, after my journey through family court, I'd been essentially wiped out and already made homeless. And subsequent to that, then this fraudulent claim was made.
I believe you were a very successful businessman. How did all of this affect that?
Well, I'd say moderately successful. I had a team of just under 30 people.
Well, that's successful to me.
Yeah, I mean, you know, not just a team, family. You know, when you build a business like that, they become largely your family. And
you had, I imagine, you had a lot of good self-worth. Like you've accomplished things. You're a go-getter. You felt good about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a self-starter. Before I started the business, which was over 20 years ago now, you know, I had a sporting career. So, you know, I'm one of those, you know, annoying overachievers, a bit like you.
Thank you.
And you know, my journey through family court put an end to all of that. You know, it essentially ruined me financially. It brought the business to its knees and wiped that out. It left me homeless and in a position where I would ultimately have to start over. And at the tail end of my journey through family court, a fraudulent claim was made against me, which the child maintenance service fully supported, put their whole weight behind. Even at the point of, you know, at that point I was on the verge of filing for bankruptcy, and they came after me with gusto, and I was just really astonished at their conduct at that point. So, you know, one particular phone call with one particular member of staff, where it was pretty clear that I was on my knees, seemed to take great pleasure in assuring me that when I come out of bankruptcy, they'd be there waiting and they would enforce this manufactured debt that had been created.
So you've got no light at the end of the tunnel? Because, I mean, for people who are bankrupt, it's lower than low. At least there's some end to the pain and misery, but there's not.
So, I mean, it's become a barrier now to getting back on my feet because, you know, having been made homeless once already, there's a real fear of becoming successful again because I know that it will kick off another round of the same. And those who have succumbed to suicide, you know, there are too many stories where I've heard that what's ultimately led to that is that the CMS have gone into their bank accounts unannounced and taken all their money. So they can't afford to pay their rent or their mortgage or put food on the table or clothe their kids or whatever it may be.
Can you talk a bit more, you specifically, did you have those thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I'm a planner. I manage my money quite well, all the more so now when there's so little of it. And, you know, you're making your forecasts and there would not have been enough to sustain a roof over my head were I to reach any kind of level of success and unannounced. The child maintenance service would go and take that at any level they decided up to the level of the debt, which is pretty extensive.
So, for those who are saying, well, you know, you should pay for your kids, you know, you're a successful man, you should pay for your kids. I mean, but were the fees extortionate? Were they overinflated?
Well, they were based on my earnings from 6 years ago, which had been wiped out. My ability to generate income had been wiped out. And the money wasn't there. So you can't magic it out of thin air. And you certainly can't do that when you've been made homeless.
And you spoke to them? What did they say? They didn't care?
It was black and white as far as they were concerned. I'd earned that before, therefore I must be able to earn it now. The circumstances around that money not being there, they weren't interested in. And I did take that to tribunal. And it transpired that they'd created some regulations that allowed them to ignore certain types of reasons that money was no longer there. That it allows them to not take into consideration the conduct of the other party to the case that led to there being no money there, and they wanted to just enforce a debt that they had created based on historical income that it was clear to them was not achievable, and that money had essentially evaporated, and they were going to find a way to enforce it.
So you compiled this report. I mean, I don't know what your business was, but it's very extensive. So whatever you did before, you've used your skill set to compile the most comprehensive report. Can you tell people what you found in your report?
Yes, I've always been pretty good with numbers. I'm good with money. I understand accounting, I understand forecasting, I understand what it costs to live. And one of the things that leapt out at me when I started writing this, collating the data, first of all, the data wasn't out there. I couldn't find anyone else that had written anything like it. I wanted answers. I wanted to find out if I was being individually persecuted or if it was a wider problem. Clearly it was a wider problem. There were lots of people complaining, but there was no real data, hard data, to understand the scale and the depth of the problem. So that led to lots of freedom of information requests asking for data, many of which were turned down. But ultimately, I managed to get hold of what I needed. And when COVID hit us, the term excess deaths came around. And it struck me that I could start running some calculations on what normal mortality rates would be in what are quite large it's quite a large population that fall under the Child Maintenance Service. So, we're getting towards 1 million people, split almost evenly, mothers and fathers. And so as a cohort, I wanted to just compare the mortality rate amongst the paying parents and the mortality rate amongst the receiving parents. And it was very quickly obvious that the receiving parents were actually slightly below what you would expect as a mortality rate nationally for those relevant age groups, and the paying parents were 4 or 5 times higher than the mortality rate you would expect. And I thought that was pretty alarming in itself. So that led me to dig deeper. And on digging deeper...
That is alarming.
Yeah. Well, it gets more alarming. So, so that paying parent population is pretty big. It's approaching 500,000 now. So what I did is I took that section of the population and I divided it into paying parents who don't have any arrears and paying parents who do have arrears. And that's essentially defined by those who are paying direct and those who have been moved on to collect and pay or a deduction from their earnings. And what I found was in that smaller section of the population, their mortality rate was actually over 14 times higher than the national rate of death.
Wow. So
that also was pretty compelling. And that led me to divide that between males and females, mothers and fathers. We've already heard, I think, that some 96% of paying parents are fathers, and the rest mothers. And I wanted to look at specifically how many people that is that are dying who otherwise wouldn't be. If they were in the rest of the population, they wouldn't be dying. And that led me to calculate that on average over the 3-year period that I had data, 1,013 excess deaths were happening in the paying parent population. Well, when I finished the report, of course, I sent it into all the key ministers in government and in the opposition. I sent it to leading mental health charities. I've sent it into leaders in the NHS. And it's been a wall of silence from them so far. Of course,
why is that, in your educated opinion?
I think it's something that they don't want to acknowledge. They've created this monster. It's such an enormous scandal.
Couldn't these excess deaths be something not attributed to the suicide because of CMS?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had the same question when I found that data and was so alarmed by it. And, you know, funnily enough, you know, COVID and lockdown produced another gift in terms of being able to identify, you know, a correlation, a compelling correlation. And that is that CMS have a range of enforcement practices that they carry out. They're very active on enforcing against paying parents. And when they locked down, that enforcement activity reduced by, I calculated to be about 28%. And in that same period of time, the volume of parental deaths reduced by virtually the same amount. So there's clearly a connection between
Black and white.
child maintenance service enforcement activity and the rate at which parents will die.
Brian, what have you done to highlight this problem, and what responses have you had?
Well, immediately I completed the study. I sent copies into the leading political parties, obviously into government and the opposition, to all the ministers responsible for that department and, you know, key ministerial positions. I then followed that up with actually sending a copy to every single MP. The House of Lords, most of the peers in the House of Lords, about 600 of them, have had a copy.
What was their response?
I didn't get any response other than...
No response whatsoever?
Two or three of the MPs said, sorry, we can't look at it, you're not in our area. I did have a couple of MPs who are sympathetic to these type of issues come back to me and ask a few questions, but that didn't ultimately lead anywhere. And then I also suspect that many hundreds of other people have also sent this document into the Child Maintenance Service. I sent it into the management myself. And then in January, I did have a reach out from Child Maintenance Service to ask for a copy. So that was on the 15th of January. Of course, I sent them a copy, and there's been nothing since. So we obviously know that they've got that.
Do you think they are worried?
Well, you know, given the data that they refuse to release, and given the continued denial when they're asked questions about this, and their refusal to accept that there's any link, it suggests that they are locking down against it. And then if you also look at what's going on in the media, the continuation of the deadbeat dad narrative that's been in most of the mainstream press this year, some of that's been challenged with the ICO, not the ICO, the Press Complaints Commission, and you know that they've been found against in the press for the stories that they're publishing to be factually incorrect. You know, where I am with that right now is just wondering why you have an organisation that's been alerted to a very serious problem, who are closing up.
Am I right in saying it's not sustainable? Because I can't see how it possibly can be. What they're doing is literally going to destroy society. It's going to implode and collapse. Well,
financially, the structure of CMS could never work. It could never have worked, and it never will work. I think any reasonable accountant would look at the structure for calculating maintenance and would be able to tell you that if you set it against what the cost of living is, in terms of just being able to provide the very basics you need to live, the calculation they use can never work. And when you take parents who have highly likely been through a traumatic breakup, may well have been through family court preceding that, and the family estate has been possibly raided by legal professionals, but it's been under severe pressure already. It's really a recipe for disaster. So to lay, you know, to approach enforcing child maintenance at that point on a deadbeat dad narrative, where you're using a sledgehammer, you know, as your means to get revenue in.
Do these people, do they believe they're doing something good? I mean, I've seen in a bit of research some people involved who've been given knighthoods because of their sterling work in the community to stop deadbeat dads and help children out of poverty, when actually what we're seeing is it's not helping, it's destroying society.
Yeah.
Are they just buried their heads in the sand? Is it corrupt?
I suspect there's corruption, but the thing that really bothers me is that I think that any reasonable and responsible person or entity, if alerted to something of this magnitude, would want to do one of a few things. They would probably want to prove that it's not true, number one.
Yeah.
Right? I would certainly want to prove that. And before I try to prove it to the public, I would want to prove it to myself. So I would be looking at my own data. I would probably call in the people that are protesting and say, to understand where they're coming from. Paying parents have no voice with the CMS, despite the fact that that's what's funding them, right? Ultimately, their voice is completely silenced. It's if you're a responsible organisation and someone alerts you to this level of harm, the first thing you want to do is make sure that they're wrong. And the first step in that is to really understand the problem in depth. So if I had been in their shoes, I would have invited me in to sit around a table with me and really get to grips with the study. And I would open the books in terms of data so that I could help them to identify whether there is an actual causal relationship between those deaths and what they're doing.
The but is, though, if they're going to find that it's not sustainable, hang on, if we invite this guy in, this Brian in, he's going to show us how to make it better. Actually, we can't make it better. It's not going to work. Why they're not going to invite you in, are they? Is that what you're finding?
Well, I can't really answer that question because I can only guess as to what their reasons are. If I was in their position and it turned out that I was responsible for over 1,000 parental deaths every year for the last few decades, then I'd be particularly worried about my own liberty after that.
Brian, to finish off with Brian, what would your message be to anybody else who's suffering in this position?
Well, I'd ask them to join us. Don't suffer alone. We've got, this organisation is growing, the movement's growing. We're getting very organised. We know what we're doing. We know what the problem is. We know what the scale of it is. There's a great energy among these people. So the first step is to reach out to us and what we're doing. Reach out to every group. Be part of it. Find some defiance. Stand up and say no, like we are.
I don't know if that's a good thing, but if this is a corrupt society, if every paying parent stopped paying CMS, would that be an answer?
I don't think it's the answer right now. I think that would send a message that would be misused.
Yeah.
And I think protesters have fallen into that trap before, and essentially given ammunition to legal professionals and to this organisation to perpetuate the deadbeat dad narrative and the other myths around paying parents, trying to evade responsibility, and that's not what we really want to portray because it's not the truth.
Correct. Brian, thank you very much, sir.